Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the City UK virtual member briefing on COP28. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Miles Celic and I'm the Chief Executive Officer at the City UK. I'm delighted to welcome all of you to this member briefing, this time concentrating on the key takeaways from COP28 and what the implications are for the financial and related professional services industry. This year's COP marked the first global stocktake of the progress made in achieving the Paris Agreement targets, which committed countries to limit global warming to below 2 degrees and ideally below 1.5 degrees. The two-week event was kicked off with an opening from the host country that set the vision and tone for what were complex negotiations ahead, and it brought together policymakers, regulators, industry, and other key stakeholders to explore how we address climate change in an inclusive and in an accountable way. At the City UK, sustainability is embedded as a core strategic priority, one of our 5 as set by our members. And as an organisation, we set out evidence to inform the debate and aim to influence the policy environment and the regulatory frameworks to ensure that the UK is positioned at the forefront of green and sustainable finance. I was in Dubai with colleagues and members for the first week of COP and participated in a number of roundtables and panel discussions on how the industry is supporting the transition to net zero, the current barriers, risks and challenges that are preventing the FRPS industry from scaling up its support, and the need for international cooperation and collaboration to ensure a consistent and coordinated approach in the transition to net zero. From an industry perspective, I think there were a number of key takeaways around the launch of the Loss and Damage Fund to provide support to countries that are impacted by climate-related disasters, the launch of the Global Climate Finance Centre to address key barriers and to help climate finance flow, the need for a greater public-private partnership and that private capital is ready to invest. What's needed, I thought, that emerged from the conversations is the signals and the clarity from governments, the progress in the development of coherent and internationally aligned disclosure frameworks, in particular the significant support that existed for the ISSB standards, and the strengthening of the integrity of the voluntary carbon markets. And I think it was also interesting looking at the way that the multilateral development banks pledged billions for sustainable projects and announced a common approach for reporting climate results. But I'm delighted to be able to be joined by a terrific panel to reflect on their own experiences and perspectives on COP, on what happened, on what didn't happen perhaps, and also on what needs to happen next. So if I could just ask my fellow panelists to come off mute and to turn their cameras on. I am joined by Stephanie Glover, the Head of Strategy and Sustainable Finance at Guernsey Finance. Stephanie is the lead for green and sustainable finance initiatives, including the development of strategy and positioning for green and sustainable finance issues within Guernsey. She also sits on the City UK's Next Generation Leadership Council. Also joined by Stephanie Betts, the Head of Alliances, Coalitions and Reporting at Aon Climate. Stephanie is a lawyer and entrepreneur and has been the head of the Alliances, Coalitions and Reporting for Aon's climate team since July 2022. She's also a senior member of the Governance Committee of Women in Banking and Finance. And I'm also delighted to be joined by Gillian Lofts, Global Sustainable Finance Leader at EY, where she is responsible for developing and building EY's capability in this area. She's also been part of the Embankment Project for Inclusive Capitalism for the last 6 years and sits on the IIF Sustainability Finance Working Group and leads the Sustainable Finance Knowledge Partnership within the European Banking Federation. So I'm sure you'll agree that is a formidable amount of expertise around the call. So I'll just start with a sort of an initial question to all of the panelists about what was your organisation's involvement with COP28 this year? What were your key priorities and objectives in attending this year's event? Jill, perhaps we can start with you.
Of course, thank you, Miles. It's great to be with you all this afternoon. So from an overall EY perspective, we were focused on one message, which was we need to close the gap between ambition and real action, leaving nobody behind. We were a strategic business partner for COP28, and one of the responsibilities that we had as part of that was to validate sponsor activities. So we were appointed as an independent partner by the UNFCCC to validate the commitments made and supporting evidence for the organisations that wanted to sponsor the conference. We rated them against the Race to Zero criteria, and then provided the technical advice to the COP sponsorship committee. So that was a lot of effort up front before we even got to COP. We ran 80 events across the blue zone, the green zone, and other venues focused on energy transition, cities, carbon markets, and sustainable finance. And Miles, as you said, I'm involved in the financial services sector. So we looked at sustainable finance, transition finance, blended finance, and voluntary carbon markets as our key themes. And I think what we were looking to do was create action through show me how, through convening relevant discussions and debate for advancement, for listening to others, because that's a critical part, I think, of the process. And then finally, collaborating in what effectively is this really complex ecosystem.
Jill, thanks very much for that. Stephanie Betts.
Fantastic. Thank you again for having us today. It's basically sort of hot off the press because I think the announcements are still, as we all know, rolling in with COP. So for Aon, it was a slightly different angle to, obviously, to EY. We have done climate data for a very long time, and climate insights and data analytics. That's really our core sort of heritage. But I think getting into the frame of, the climate debate and sort of specific climate solution is something that is still relatively new to us. So this COP last year I was the only person, but there's two of us actually at COP. And this year we had a delegation of 8, I think, 8. And it's been, so what we're trying to do is actually really assess the role that not just the industry can play, like finance, but insurance. And last year, it was very clear to us that people were starting to sort of make some noises about insurance and how the role of insurance was actually quite critical to, to progress. And if you look at insurance, it's actually, I always call it the seed of resilience. So if you are an entrepreneur or if you have a farmer somewhere in, developing countries, if you know that you have backup, that this room is getting dark, I'm not moving enough. If you know that you have insurance, you will be able to take different decisions. You will be able to take more risk. You will be able to invest. You'll be able to have a return on your investment. And you'll be able to get back on your feet if something doesn't go right. So we think this is a really essential component of progress. It's an essential component of innovation. And the way we see our role is, in helping capital, matching capital to solutions. So there's a big element of de-risking innovation. So that's kind of the cap we were bringing and the lens we're bringing to COP this year. And looking at what we've actually announced and what we've done, one of the other reasons we're going to COP is just to really see how we could actually improve and accelerate the work that we're doing in the space. But the other thing was also to make an announcement, because through the year we started to do some work, and that's very much of an Aon thing. We're not very big on announcement, but we like to actually do things, and then ex-post we then make an announcement. So when we looked at the role that we could play, one of the biggest risks that our clients, we feel, don't talk enough about is water risk and the risk of water scarcity, which is in its wake bringing obviously issues with, food security, but also limitations in terms of, anything from the energy transition becomes very challenged when you run out of water, to semiconductors, which are part of our life. So suddenly you realize that water is infiltrated in every single component of the economy. And then we decided to look at, how can we have a positive impact on something so critical? And it became very clear to us when we looked at the various areas of, of activities, that agriculture and land use were critical. Agriculture uses 70% of the world's fresh water. And the answer to this is actually simply to move to regenerative practices. So what we've done is we looked at how can we help support this movement at scale. And that's really one of the big sort of axes that we've taken. So it was very directional. It was very sector focused. It's not all we've done, but that was a big part of our focus at COP this year. And we announced an agreement with the African Development Bank. We're going to help them de-risk activity across the continent, but primarily on the food system and the food value chain. So that was really one of the biggest, landmarks, if you want, for us this year, and hoping to help move most of the continent to regenerative agriculture, and trying to ideally, in an ideal world, to make it very simple for people listening to us, is if you think of what Africa's done with telephony, they didn't go to a landline, they went straight to mobile phone. And what we're hoping is that with agriculture and food system, there is an opportunity here to move directly to much better systems, moving to regenerative agriculture, leveraging emerging technologies. And I think the key point for us is that for insurance to be able to play a really big role on the international scene and on the climate fight, we need to leverage emerging technologies. So satellite data, sensors, AI, all of this needs to be leveraged, because it's going to bring a level of transparency which will enable us to better assess risk. And therefore, in some parts, we'll realize that the risk is lower, and we can go ahead and we can help companies and technologies to progress much faster. So that's basically our COP.
Thank you, Stephanie, and glad to see that the energy efficiency measures at Aon are working robustly. Stephanie Glover, Guernsey's been a real trailblazer as jurisdiction in this space. Over to you.
Oh, thank you so much for saying that. Really appreciate it. Yeah, so sustainable finance has been a key priority for Guernsey since around kind of 2017. If you're not familiar with Guernsey, we're an international finance centre and have around 300 billion in regulated investment funds. And we really want to use that expertise in private equity, infrastructure, and then also private wealth management and insurance as well. We have a large reinsurance and captive insurance sector, and using the expertise we have as a finance centre to enable that swifter transition, I think, to net zero. This is my third COP, so my first was Glasgow and then Montreal, a nature-related COP. I think being at COP for us is, as an international finance centre, it's such a valuable way for us to connect with that international sustainability community. I think particularly being in Dubai, being in the UAE, a growing international finance centre, having so much business, having so much financial services business is there. It was so valuable for us. I think, like Jill said, to meet, to learn, to share collectively, and that's always been our focus of attending COPs. There were several kind of themes that we wanted to address while we were there. So our regulator is also joining our delegation, our financial service regulator, talking with the network of the green and financial system, with other global regulators and central banks. I think ISSB will, the acronym hopefully of the century almost. So but how can ISSB be adopted by smaller international finance centres like Guernsey? For non-listed companies, for non-listed funds, how can ISSB be implemented? And I think that was a real consideration for us in Guernsey. We also looked at circular economy and sustainable finance in Guernsey, some of the developments we've made there. Of course, attending TheCityUK briefings is always a highlight while we're out in Dubai. Particularly, we also attend, so Guernsey's a member of the United Nations Financial Centres of Sustainability, and they've just launched a Gender Charter report. And it was really fantastic to see around 30 members of that community signing up to a Gender Charter. I think to supporting gender initiatives and sustainable finance, they go so closely hand in hand. So for us, that was really valuable as well. We did also have 2 members of our government attending COP28 as well. So we're not a country, so we attend with part of the UK delegation. And so valuable, I think, for those members of our government to share unique island perspectives onto the kind of net zero journey as a government. So that was really pleasing as well.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Stephanie. I'm going to move on to a few more questions for the panel shortly, but just to remind participants in the briefing that you can send in your own questions. So there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen where you can send in questions, or feel free to email or text those to me directly. If you don't have my email address, it's miles.celic@thecityuk.com. Moving on, and this one is really for Jill and for Stephanie Glover. There was a huge amount of activity at COP28, as we've already sort of touched on in the initial conversation. Huge number of events, huge number of initiatives launched and so on. For you, from the perspectives that you're looking at, and Stephanie Betts, I'll come to you from an insurance perspective in a moment, but from Stephanie Glover first, what was for you the single most important thing that you think you saw?
So I do think the biggest achievement, actually, and I feel like I'm worried about being kind of controversial, was the final signing. I know we didn't get phase out, which was the kind of the binary measure of the COP success at a phase out rather than phase down, and instead we got the rather strange transitioning away from fossil fuels. I listened to I don't know if you listened to the Outrage and Optimism podcast. Nigel Topping was on it a couple of days ago, and he's my absolute favourite on this. And he was saying, look, the IPCC report was only released 5 years ago. Back in 2019, they were unsure if they could have a discussion around companies committing to net zero. So to have a global baseline where all countries have agreed to move away from fossil fuels, yes, it's not enough, but that is a huge progress, I think. And it gives a lot of opportunity, I think, for places like Europe, like the UK, to say, yes, we know that's the global baseline moving away from, but it gives us the opportunity to go further. So I think having that agreed global baseline that just says the words fossil fuels, that's incredible from where we were 5 years ago. So I think for me, that's definitely the biggest achievement.
Brilliant. Thank you, Stephanie. Jill, from your perspective?
I totally agree with Stephanie. We see this as it's not one, but many energy transitions. Countries are transitioning at different rates. So whilst the phase out rather was let's say touted a few days ago and maybe hoped for a few days ago, I think just bearing in mind a just transition, being equitable to all nations, thinking about the diversity of the different markets. And then I'm just going to add 3 things, Miles, if I can. You went through a lot of the announcements and initiatives at the beginning of this call. I think the thing that we're focused on from a sort of financial services perspective is the increased ambition. So not just fossil fuels, but the numerous announcements that there were around trebling renewable energy, doubling fuel efficiency, helping hard to abate sectors, agriculture, deforestation. There were so many announcements around ambition, and I think thinking all of that through is going to be really critical. And then the other 2 areas, again, you mentioned them, an unprecedented amount of finance that has now been pledged. The last time we counted it was about 83 billion. I'm sure that things have moved around a lot since then, but that is a significant amount for a COP. And then finally, this whole mechanism, the creating and building better standards, better frameworks, better data, et cetera. So there were so many announcements, initiatives around those 3 pillars that I think we will need to pick over all of that, really to then think about how does that change our strategy? How does it change how we actively engage with different financing mechanisms, whether it's blended finance, transition finance, voluntary carbon markets, etc. But I think it felt like a huge amount of momentum.
No, I very much agree with that, and I think you've raised some really interesting points that I'd love to come back to in a moment. But first, I'm going to go to Stephanie Betts. And Stephanie, I have to say, as somebody who was in insurance before I came to this role, it's always great to hear about the role that insurance can play and is playing in these areas. From your point of view, what was the main achievement of COP from an insurance perspective?
So I think, I don't want to repeat what my other fellow panelists have just said, but I would tend to agree that everything that was done probably paled in comparison to the last gavel, the last minute, the fact that we actually somehow got there, almost got there. That alone is a big achievement. I think from an insurance perspective, what was brilliant is actually to see a lot of insurers out there and to feel that we belong here. We have to be part of those conversations because we can help de-risk. And it's having that aha moment, speaking to entrepreneurs and people, trying to really accelerate the move to green energy, and saying, well, then and if they're struggling to get capital, we say, well, have you looked at insurance? Have you looked at de-risking your technology? And they go, of course, maybe that's just what I needed. And you think there's lots of things that can be facilitated by insurance, because we can lower the risk for the ultimate investor, and that's really what matters. I think in terms of achievements, as you said, there were so many announcements that it's really hard to pick them out. And also, you see lots of announcements that talk about coalitions and people wanting to do things, but that doesn't mean that these things are going to get done. And that's really where we were before. We've done a lot of commitments before. We've seen a lot of commitments. And I think the proof is going to be in COP29 to see what happened to these commitments, what was really done. So I would say what was interesting is actually to see other ourselves, but also other competitors really committing to emerging markets, committing in particular to Africa, committing to closing the protection gap, irrespective of location or activity. And I thought that was a really interesting take for us to see that, you know, we need to de-risk the world, because we have to look at what's happening as a big, you know, we're in a situation where you have a very high level of systemic risk. And I think insurers have to take a different approach to things and start to think a bit more like central bankers. How do we help our clients lower the level of risk, let's say, in their supply chains, in their activities? How can we help them future-proof their businesses? But by doing so, how can they contribute to lowering the kind of ambient risk that we're dealing with right now, with a number of tipping points that seems to be close to breach? And I think that is a new way of looking at insurance, I believe, but I think this is really essential. And hopefully we'll see a lot more of that towards COP29 and at COP29, where people have to actually show that they have skin in the game, and we all have to play our part. And it's a sports game, and it's a collaborative game. You know, it's not, so it's very difficult to isolate just one company. And I think for me, what's shifting over the last 2 or 3 COPs is less, oh, these companies announced this, but more the industry is moving. The industry is getting in the frame. So that's really where I see the big difference. And in terms of themes, what I was really encouraged by is to see that obviously, you know, the number one was the phase out, transition away from fossil fuel, but also from soil emissions. And the importance of soil has been recognized at this COP. And I think that's hugely important, because that can have a huge impact, both on emissions, but also on water scarcity. Also, the fact that impact is becoming mainstream. More and more funds, you know, realize that whatever they do, finance will have to be green, and that we have to begin embedding natural capital into our reporting, but more than that, into our strategy at the very start of discussions, at the very start of the design of the products, or the design of a supply chain, or the redesign of a supply chain. So embedding natural capital is critical, and I think like TNFD will make a big difference in that, helped by all the other systems that are converging, and the role of IOSCO also, which is often I found very underrated, to bring all the constituents together and to get rid of the alphabet soup. You know,
so there was definitely a lot of the alphabet soup, and I sort of lost count of the number of 3-letter acronyms that were sort of, or more, that were sort of rolling around. But and it's great to hear from all three, and I'll go to Jill first with the sort of follow-up question to this, because it's great to hear the positivity that's in the room, and I share, you know, that there was a lot of positive outcomes to the discussion. But the pushback would be surely that if we are talking about 125 trillion needed to effectively decarbonize the global economy, there was a study done a few years ago that suggested there's 9.2 trillion needed per year to decarbonize by 2040, I think it was, and we're running at about 5.2. The cynic surely would say 83 billion at COP is meaningless. I mean, it is not even a drop in the bucket. And whilst COP26 was, I think, famously, and it was a terrific job done by the people who pulled it together and led it, you know, the first time really that the private sector felt part of the conversation, there was a sort of sense, I thought, that the private sector conversation and the public sector conversation were happening in parallel rather than necessarily always entirely together. You know, I think one point that was raised was that parts of COP felt a bit like a trade fair, and other parts of COP felt like governments talking to each other. Was there enough of the partnership that's going to be needed? And this has already been touched upon in this conversation, between government, business, the third sector, global and international institutions to really drive this forward. Jill, would you like to kick us off on that?
That's a massive question.
I hope you don't mind me going to you first.
No, not at all. And I seem to have the same lighting issues as Stephanie. I did notice myself kind of going into nearly almost complete pitch black. Yes, look, I think so. In terms of pledges, yes, that feels low. I think the whole idea is that it significantly gets leveraged. There's lots of different calculations, whether it's 10 times. There seem to be a fair amount of calculations that suggest that perhaps private finance can bring in 10 times amount of capital as the public finance. I think the other aspect is, and we did a little tally up of what's been committed and pledged so far, which we reckon adds up to 20.8 trillion. Of that, only 1.1 trillion has been deployed. So I think there's a few issues here. One is how much has actually been deployed versus pledged. And then the other one is how much the private sector can leverage what might be coming from philanthropic MDBs or governments. And those are both very knotty subjects. I want to go back to what Stephanie said. I mean, we had some real aha moments with the insurance sector. And interestingly, that was with financial services, within financial services, where asset managers and banks were perhaps not as connected with insurers, understanding the risks that they would be very comfortable taking, that the asset managers or the banks wouldn't be very comfortable taking. And that could obviously form anything, as you said, Stephanie, from technology risk, climate risk, but also taking risk at a fund level and a portfolio level, which again, when the banks and insurers, when the banks and asset managers, and to some extent insurers, are looking at scaling up, then finding bigger deals, finding deals that you can replicate, thinking about standards, but also thinking about a portfolio. All of these kind of aspects are important to the scaling up exercise. We purposely chose sustainable finance, transition finance, blended finance, and voluntary carbon markets as our 4 key topics, because we think that they are subscale at the moment. They're super complex, not only because of the ecosystem that needs to work well together to deliver on them and to scale up, but because of the evolving data, the evolving standards, the evolving practices. So to your point, Miles, on, how is business connecting with government and other actors in the value chain? It does still feel like that's work in progress. I think we've started to narrow down with some of the initiatives that have been launched, whether that be around the voluntary carbon markets, whether that be around multilateral development banks, and other engines for frameworks and efficiency, and of course, including things like the ISSB. So I think there feels like there are more ingredients, and we said this when we were talking before, there are now more ingredients for financial services to bake some really great cakes.
I love that baking cake analogy. I think that's fantastic. I'm going to go to Stephanie Betts in just a moment, but I just want to follow up on something that's come up in the conversation. I think everybody's raised at one point or other. And just come back to you on this, Jill, which is this role for blended finance. I mean, you've talked about the way that we can utilize some of the commitments that have been made, the pledges, the deployment that we've already seen to unlock further finance. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting in the discussions was, this is about blended finance, it's about first loss, it's about the appropriate regulatory provision. It really needs governments to lean in to unlock the private sector, because it doesn't matter where in the world you are. I just don't think that any state can step up alone. The private sector can't step up alone. It needs a much more enlightened vision about how we can take this forward, don't you think?
Yeah, I absolutely do. I think we have seen with the US IRA, with the EU Green Deal, we've seen some large scale initiatives that can help with this. And I think to some extent, they should drive efficiency in terms of investment and deployment of capital, both for green projects and, if you will, transitional. that does still leave the question open around blended finance in the global south, which is much more complex, much more regional. As you say, we'll have other types of risks, country risk, currency risk, political risk, etc. But I think just because it's difficult, it is also incredibly necessary. So I think a combination of deploying the capital in the developed markets where already you've got some great initiatives, but then really trying to crack that nut in the global south where it's probably even more urgently needed. That's
a really, really good point. Stephanie Betts?
That's a brilliant segue, thank you. So I was looking, when I was preparing the session, I was just looking back at my experience at this COP, and it seemed, I agree, that we're getting closer to baking that cake because we're just on the edge of things. We're not quite there yet, but just it feels a bit more on the edge of things. And I've had a number of really fascinating conversations with global donors, for instance, which, who are keen to help, but we need to find the right key, the same language. And I could see we still, looking at, okay, so what do you need out of this? What do we need out of this? How do we bring this together in order to build a fantastic, sort of milestone project that can then be replicated at scale? And I think that if I look at how the private sector can really unlock progress, because the private sector will have to do the heavy lifting. This is where the money is, by far and large, right? And this is also where the companies, the innovation, that's where all of that lives. And I think the two big levers for the private sector are obviously robust policies. So that's your Green Deal and the IRA, but also concessional finance and working together with organizations which are dedicated to really helping, these situations, these solutions. But by de-risking the first step, then you can bring private capital in. And I think this is really how we can find out who can work together, how we can work together on projects to de-risk certain projects and enable private capital to really go at scale. And then obviously leveraging emerging technologies, which will give us the transparency and the data that we needed to take better decisions. Intergovernmental cooperation is absolutely critical. That's another key element, I think, which we mentioned earlier on in the call, because you need to have, look, we're looking at one planet, we can't have a million different standards. We're looking at one soil, we're looking at one ocean. We need to have similar standards so that we can all pull in the same direction. And by far and large, we all want the same thing. We all bring something different. So we just need to make sure there's enough alignment. The other thing I wanted to mention is we also need to think when we build those programs about what their impact is going to be in terms of adaptation and in terms of behavioral shift. Because too often on the climate front, we've been looking at sort of aid, remediation measures, mitigation measures. We now need to future-proof. We might have already blown through 1.5 for all we know. Scientists will tell us in a little while. So there are things we can't put back in the bottle. We're going to have to deal with a level of an escalating level of natural catastrophes that are coming our way anyway. So we've got to get ready for that, and we have to start mitigating the future so that this rhythm, this escalation actually starts to soften over time. But it's not going to happen overnight. But so that's why adaptation is critical, because if we do not embed adaptation in the program that we are designing, and if we do not create programs that are triggering behavioral shifts, I think we will not win the long-term race. And I think that's a really important element of it. And part of adaptation and behavioral shift is also to look at a just transition, how we get everybody on the bus, how we also leverage things like indigenous knowledge. 70% of the biodiversity, 80% of the biodiversity still remaining in the world is under indigenous knowledge. So that alone gives us a clue as to where the real knowledge is to support nature that will in turn support us. And I think my last point on this is when people are talking about natural capital, saying it supports probably 50% of our economies, it's wrong. It's probably 100%. So we don't really have the choice in this. And therefore adaptation is critical now. We need to start planning for a slightly different world.
I think that adaptation point is a really interesting one, and I thought that came through quite interestingly in a lot of the conversations in COP, that it's not just about dealing with trying to keep temperatures below 1.5 or 2. You can sort of comment on what Bill Gates said, whether it was helpful or not, but certainly what it absolutely raised was the need for adaptation as well as mitigation. Moving to you, Stephanie Glover. I totally I think some really interesting sort of conversational points that have come up. From the point of view of a smaller financial centre, albeit one that is hugely impressive, you have the virtue of being able to work closely with government already, similarly to your counterparts in Jersey, for instance. And you talked about how government was already part of the delegation that you took over. How do you approach these sorts of challenges from the point of view of making sure that there's a consistency, not just of policy, but of execution between the private sector and the public sector?
It's really interesting. I think in Guernsey, we've kind of historically recognised that we sort of have an outsized influence that we can have, and it's an international finance centre, whereas our own emissions as an island are tiny. And I think that they're trying to balance with the kind of where can we be most impactful, and that's definitely within the sustainable finance sector. I almost want to go back to your point earlier. We've got billions here and not trillions. That's just a drop in the ocean. But I think within climate change, it's not a zero-sum game. It's every kind of billions. It's every small decision that governments make that will move the needle on this and will kind of save lives, will save parts of the planet, will kind of stop us from getting to these tipping points. I think from kind of looking at UK and Guernsey, that kind of collaboration between our own financial services centres, look, that agreement, I think it was 120 countries signing the pledge to triple renewable energy. We've talked a lot about finding new projects, finding new financing. These infrastructure deals are the ones already getting the financing. These are the ones that they're almost the easy wins here. We see these funds being set up in Guernsey and then being run through the UK and supporting the UK infrastructure as well. They're being oversubscribed. The financing, I think, actually is there. And yes, we do need to de-risk the more risky projects. But from what we see talking to private equity companies, the financing, the banks, they've got the finance. It's ready there to deploy. It's those investable, bankable projects. So actually, I would almost say it's less about kind of getting governments to de-risk the financing mechanisms for us, and more about how can we work with, I think, Jill, you mentioned the multilateral development banks, the MDBs. How can we work with them to take these very tiny, small little pockets and small ideas, bunch them together and make them investable bank opportunities? I think actually that's the most important bit where we can be most influential in places, like the financing companies like the UK and like Guernsey. I think that lack of investable bankable opportunities is where the kind of stopper is, not necessarily on government action. I think adaptation finance, I think that was really interesting. And it's definitely my sort of bingo card word of COP. I think having that hell summer last year, experiencing climate impacts firsthand, not just across developing or emerging economies, but corporations and high income countries experiencing climate for the sort of really the first time was huge. And even feeling it in Guernsey as well. Suddenly if we can't get cucumbers, they're not getting shipped in. We're not having them. I think really experiencing that firsthand makes a massive deal. I think investment firms really looking for, again, those projects. They understand infrastructure deals, they understand renewables, but water scarcity and food investments, those are still quite new and innovative. So how can we, again, scale up those bankable projects to get investment into those areas? So I think actually, I definitely agree, use of blended financing, but actually the scaling the MLBs, working together with private equity firms to find those projects, I think for me is the most important area.
Brilliant, thank you. And that feels like quite a nice segue to a question that we've had come in from the audience from Lee Mayer of Citigroup, who's also the chair for CityUK in Northern Ireland. The summit is now in its 28th iteration. When will we see the good news of these events, agreements start to headline, rather than the talk about fossil fuels and their negative impact on the globe? It does seem that COP might have morphed into a talking shop. So Stephanie Betts, do you want to take first punt at that?
Wow, that's a good one, but that's also a tough one. I think, if we use Stephanie Glover's intervention, I think the fact that, the penny's dropped, we are getting closer to some tipping points. And by the way, I want to give a shout out to Exeter University and Professor Tim Lechner, who's published, I think, for the last couple of days, end of last week, sorry, the tipping point report. And I think we need to start thinking in terms of action now. We've had a lot of time to talk, but there is no more time to talk. We actually have to take action. We have to de-risk our business model. We have to help our clients de-risk their operations, de-risk their supply chains. We're seeing, severe constraints now due to climate. And I think that is what is going to bring action to the fore. One of the recommendations of the Tipping Point report was actually to have a global summit on tipping point, or to include tipping point into the next COP, so we can actually start taking action that will make a big difference. If you look, the problem we've had is scientists have been telling us the same thing for a long time now, but they didn't have the words. Maybe they couldn't get through to finance. Whatever, maybe we didn't have the aha moment, but now I think we've had it. Last year was the hottest year on record. We breached, I think, 1.5, if not 2 degrees, both in July last year, 1.5, and potentially 2 degrees in November last year. This year, this 2023. Sorry, I'm already in 2024. So the pennies dropped here. This is why we need to focus on action, and I hope that by changing the discussions, because we now all have skin in the game, we realize that we're all united in this, that we actually have to focus on the actions that can actually make a big difference. And I think working on those tipping points is probably a really good strategy, because this is what's going to drive the biggest result, is looking at, where is our leverage? Where do we act to get the biggest impact? It's time to be super strategic about how we use the time that we have left. And I think that hopefully should be a big shift in the next COP.
No, and that's interesting. I'll move to Stephanie Glover in a moment, but I think Lee's sort of, for my money, he's put his finger on one of the things that I think was a problem, not just at this COP, but I think it's a problem of a lot of these sorts of gatherings where we look at what is a gargantuan, I was going to say problem, but actually it's a series of interlocking problems. And as one person put it, and I've stolen the phrase shamelessly because I think it just captures this perfectly, he says, we spend a lot of time admiring the problem. And there's lots of fantastic analyses, and everyone sort of shares their particular analysis of the problem and how fantastic their analysis is. There's a lot less still of delivery of solution. Stephanie Glover?
Yeah, I'm going to quote Nigel Topping again, who quoted Winston Churchill, sort of talking about democracy, but it's a dreadful system of government, and it's the best one we've got. I think that almost resonates quite well with the COPs, that they've evolved so much from where we were, and people kind of talk about the Paris Agreement COP, right? We've got the global agreement, we've got it signed now, and let's just go away and deliver, and we need no more COPs. And there's definitely the argument there, and it comes up every year. But actually, we see from this COP, there were so many more pledges being made. We have the methane pledge, the tripling of renewables, and we haven't even yet got to carbon markets. And Jill, I'd love to hear you talk on carbon markets, because that's an agreement that didn't get made. We definitely have, the 1.5 or well under 2 degrees in Paris agreements. We now have, the climate fund that was agreed at this COP, the loss and damages fund, sorry. So I think, there still is a massive role for COPs. I mean, 100,000 people attending Dubai for a climate summit shows how powerful this is, that we've got business around the world saying this issue is so important to us. We're going to send teams of 8 people to attend, and yeah, it definitely can feel like a talking shop, and definitely can feel a bit of an overwhelming, being in that kind of green zone, blue zone areas. But there's still so many really valuable pockets with COP, and so many kind of really valuable discussions. And where else do you get kind of global leaders, activists, all in the same room at the same time? And I think that's so powerful. I think why there's always going to be kind of the criticism at the COPs and criticism of the outcomes is because you have the most forward-thinking activists and finance companies in the same room as those countries and companies who may be less far. So you're always going to get to a global baseline with the COPs. And then there's going to be the activists who are unhappy, and the people on the baseline are unhappy too. So COPs are never going to have a happy outcome, I think. But there's so many innovative pockets happening within those two streams, I think is so important.
Yeah, and good energy.
Yeah, I think there was a lot of positive energy there, and I think Stephanie, you've captured that ideally. Jill?
Yeah, so I was listening to Radio 4 this morning. They had an interview, and as I was rushing around the house, I didn't take the name of the person, but somebody who is well used to the UN process here. And he said, people expect an unambiguous outcome from COP, but that's not how the United Nations operates. And I think for me, that really sort of absolutely plays to what Stephanie and yourself had said. We've got a lot of announcements. There are a lot of initiatives. How will governments respond? how will the private sector respond? How will regulators respond? It feels like, yes, we've got the tools. It's really down to us now to move things forward, to take the action. I think there is a recognition that financial services can move fast, that it moves faster than public sector and the governments. Clearly not wanting to get into an undemocratic position, but at the same time, innovate, create, push, agitate, I think are all extremely important roles of the financial services sector.
Brilliant, thank you, Jill. Great question that's come in from Anne-Marie Stratton at BNP Paribas, who chairs our Green and Sustainable Finance Group, which I think goes to the heart of this, and actually goes to the heart of a lot of the conversations amongst policymakers around this, which is related to the question of how to resort to action. What are the panel's views on how we can best tell broader society in developed economies what the progress at COPs means for them? And in fact, I've just come back from Germany, where we held a meeting of our Anglo-German Financial Services Dialogue. This is very live in the UK, it's very live in Germany, very live in the US, where we have to explain to people what these things actually mean in practical terms, but also recognizing, to the point that's been raised about transition, that there will be costs for people. I'm going to go to Stephanie Glover first.
That's a real challenging question. I love it. I kind of want to come back to almost like a small island perspective there, being from Guernsey. And I think, never open the sort of local online press comments. I think for the local community here in Guernsey, kind of see us, as a small island. That why on earth are 8 people from Guernsey attending COP? We're not even a country. We're not even having our own kind of a stand there. We're part of the UK. So it's kind of communicating to that real local, stubborn donkey, I think is our national animal. How do you communicate, the changes of climate change? And it does feel like huge costs, and it can be really scaremongering to say, yes, it's going to be expensive, but unfortunately, this is the cheapest possible option and much more expensive to let the damages just roll. So really, really difficult, I think, to engage with the local communities. There's, like you said, hopefully we can banish the acronym soup, but trying to explain international sustainability standard boards, regulations and voluntary carbon markets, around the dinner table is hard enough. So that communicating to a real local audience is, again, such a challenge. So I almost don't know how we do service that. I think almost, I don't want to say that the experiences of climate change are going to be those real drivers, and that's such a horrible thing to say. And I really don't want to get to a position where we have to really have our own personal experiences of climate change before we can understand it. So I hope we almost don't get to that bit.
And it's a tricky one as well, because all the evidence shows that the more you catastrophize around these things, the more people switch off. Jill?
Yeah, and also the local effects, right? So in some countries, you might have a complete polarization of views around sustainability and climate change. As you say, if you are suffering the impacts of climate change today, then you might have a completely different perspective on that. I think you understand. Well, first of all, I'm going to say 40% of the world's population go to the polls next year, so that's a problem, right? And how do you create greater longevity around the NDCs and the action plans and the transition plans at a country level? I think that is absolutely critical. But aside from that, I think, and we have talked about this a lot, because should there be some global themes that people can hang that they can hang on to, but knowing that actually cultures and economies and experiences are very local and very different. So how do you manage that? Because if everything was local, if everything was sort of local and cultural, that feels like it just might end up too chaotic, and you just totally water down the message. But at the same time, if you create these global messages, then you're probably alienating loads of people, and you're probably not reflecting the full picture. So I feel that it's got to be something that can have a mass and simplistic appeal, but that you can then actually address the specific lived experiences of the people in different communities.
And I think there's an opportunity point here as well, which is, look, if we are adapting properly, if we're leaning into this, there's an opportunity for economic growth, for jobs, for regeneration, and so on.
Yeah.
Stephanie.
So I think that was my point, is when you're trying to talk to sort of regular audience who's not versed into our alphabet soup and the rest of it, nor finance, I think it's just more showing the potential. And I think it's saying, look, a long time ago, we didn't have, rails, we didn't have automobiles. Now we know that the way these automobiles were built was not necessarily a good thing, looking back, but there's been a lot of advance and a lot of progress. And I think we have to look at this as progress. We have to look at this as, we will have a lot of co-benefits from every single element that is implemented, because the challenge and the matching beauty of climate is that it's a systemic issue and everything is interrelated. And my view is, who wouldn't like clear water, lovely streams, nice beach to stroll on, lovely coral, mangrove forest protecting you from extreme weather event, greener job, greener cities, there's and lots of jobs to be created. So I think there's also a flip side that is actually really quite attractive. And I really think that people might react better to this, and they might, and this is what we're fighting for. We're fighting for the opportunity to still bring this vision to life. And I think that we need to redesign everything, the way we live, the way we eat, the way we travel. And it doesn't mean that we're going to go to scarcity or impossibility. We might actually go to a better diet with better quality food, better health, a more interesting way to travel. Better insulated homes, homes that blend more in the, in the sort of landscape they're in. So there's, we need creativity, we need courage, but we need vision. And I think if we can't translate all the work we're doing into an attractive vision, well, nobody's going to buy into it. And ultimately, the customers and the people on the streets are also the ones who are going to drive a lot of the outcomes by the products they buy or don't buy. And that's where we link back to the regulator, the transparency, so that they can make the right decisions when they go into a supermarket. Because right now, for all of us, very confusing. You have no idea which product, right, takes you to a 14-degree world, plus 14 degree, or which product is a, -2 or 1.5. So, all of that has to happen. So there's a lot that we need to bridge before we can build that lovely cake that we're all going to share, hopefully. But I think we need to also make people aware that, there's some really good outcomes out there for all of them and for all of us. And that's really worth, fighting for.
It's that positive vision. And I loved your positive vision of beaches and sunshine, because I don't know what the view from your window is like, but it is definitely not the view I've got here in London. So moving on to the final question in the remaining 5 minutes that we have. A lot of excitement, a lot of momentum that's been built around COP28, which we've talked about through the course of this conversation. As an industry, and I'll come to Stephanie Betts first, then Stephanie Glover, and last word with Jill. As an industry, how do we maintain that momentum? How do we drive that progress? How do we move into COP29 with some real energy behind it? Stephanie Betts.
Right, I'll be quick. I think the first one is governance, and the second one is cooperation. I think we need to bring better governance around to ensure that things we do aren't a one-hit wonder. Not just, sort of declarations and nothing to follow through. We need serious and solid governance around climate, all through organizations. And the second thing is collaborations. We need to go to this pre-competitive space so we can start to work together towards big, holistic solutions that we can design and support together as insurers.
Brilliant. Thank you, Stephanie. Stephanie Glover?
So I think it's allowing those working in climate to have a bit of a break over Christmas holidays, and I'm joking there, but I think seriously the availability of talent within the sustainable finance sector and within our own firms, how can we upskill those already working in financial services to have sustainable finance skills? I think as more people grow familiar with the science of climate change and climate adaptation, mitigation needs, more education on sustainable finance reporting requirements, the financing needed to meet the goals. There comes the progress momentum, just getting more people working in the space, more people educated on the science and the direction of travel here. And hopefully it won't just be small sustainability teams, it will be entire offices and entire firms working towards these goals. So for me, upskilling, rest, and is the way to drive progress momentum.
Sounds like a good recipe. Jill, final word with you.
Yeah, I think just building on some of the comments, I would say that, you know, the financial services sector has to take commercial risk, right? And I think I definitely got a vibe from FS at COP this time round that was more vocalized than in previous years. Our current financial services system has to make money to move money. And so I think you've got that on the one hand, and thinking how you deliver on that. And obviously we've talked a lot about complexities. On the other hand, you've got the cost of capital, particularly in the global south. So how does that again change? And again, we've talked about a lot of the mechanisms. And then the final bit I'm going to say is on transition plans. This has been coming up time and time again. So not just corporate transition plans, but also country transition plans. So I think, again, you know, would firms disclose voluntarily? Is that helpful? That's a question. And then how do you engage with governments to get more action and more certainty around the transition plan? Because that feels quite a tangible action that FS can utilise.
Well, I think all three of those give us some really great food for thought as we move into the planning. We're all back from COP28. We move into the planning for COP29. So this is to Stephanie's point. Maybe we'll try and get a bit of a break in between. But look, this has been a hugely enjoyable, hugely inspiring panel. I'd like to thank all of those who have dialed in and those who have contributed questions, which has been fantastic. I see we've got a comment from Euronuahan from Clifford Chance, totally agreeing on the point that's been raised on transition plans, entirely agree with that. So on behalf of all of those who dialed in, my thanks to our terrific panelists. Thank you for engaging, and we look forward to working with you in the weeks and the months ahead. But in the meantime, and to Stephanie Glover's charge to all of us, enjoy the break and have a lovely Christmas and New Year. Thanks very much indeed.